Good evening, everybody. Thank you for attending this evening's webinar. We are pleased today to get two speakers, right? One is Mr. Darren Burrows from Becca Carter. He's actually based in Singapore and he's a manager under the building services. Right, so he's going to talk to us about MEP digitalization and then looking at overview of building services engineering in the 21st century. Okay, including using software tools and workflow for a successful project implementation. Right, so that's Darren for you. But later on, after Mr. Darren is done with his sharing, we will also have Dr. Chen Kian Wee from Princeton University who will be talking to us about algorithm-assisted archi design with Python packages. Okay, an interesting sharing as well. And he will talk to you about Python-based workflow, okay, that encodes a massing design for exploration using genetic algorithm. Okay, so just stay put for our two speakers. So we can now start with Darren. All yours, Darren.
All right. Thanks very much for the introduction,
All
and
right.
thanks everybody for joining in. As mentioned, I'm going to speak to you about MEP digitalization. So let's go through that. Just a quick background on myself. I've been working for about 7+ years, but graduated from New Zealand University of Canterbury and worked there for about 3 years, but then moved to Singapore in 2017 and have been here since then and have had the opportunity to work on some pretty amazing projects, including Punggol Digital District, a business park out in Punggol, 300,000 square meters of business park office, which is supposed to be a bit of a tech hub. Also Capita Spring, a new downtown CBD high-rise tower, which is supposed to be opening at the end of this month. And then lastly is one that's about to start for construction is the Shore Tower redevelopment. So the thing that you probably don't see in any of these pictures is a whole lot of MEP. But I assure you that there is a lot of systems as part of these buildings which we need to design and maintain and things like that to make sure that these spaces are habitable. So this is here as an example of a project that I did before I moved to Singapore in New Zealand, which is actually a hospital. And this is just stripping back to all of the MEP services, right? All the ductwork and light fittings and pipes and all that sort of reticulation, which you don't see naturally. And so really that's what I wanted to talk about today is it's more about a workflow and some ideas around software tools which you might want to use. But it's with an MEP perspective in mind, right? And so there is obviously a lot of automation design tools and things out there that you can use. To be honest, a reflection from my perspective is that they're not that mature for MEP. So I think my presentation it'll briefly touch on some of those ideas, but it will also really mainly focus around the workflow for enabling a coordinated model approach, right, together with architecture and structures. So as you may already know, right, there's a ton of different modeling softwares, design authoring tools, fabrication tools, visualization, clash detection, all those sorts of things that you can use, right? And you get confused as to, oh, hang on, what's the one I should use, right? How does it and how does that link in, and how can that talk to any other systems that I might be using, right? And if I've chosen let's say Revit as my primary authoring tool, how does that speak to someone else who's using ArchiCAD, or can that flow backwards and forwards into my design softwares, or do I have to use some other way to get there by using, say, Grasshopper or Ladybug? So there's a whole lot of stuff out there. And so what I thought would be good is what I'm going to talk you through is how we do it when we're actually delivering real projects, right? How do we set up our systems, and how we successfully collaborate together with the other design parties, clients, other stakeholders, and make sure information is transferred around in an efficient manner. So this here is actually something we've drawn up as a bit of a workflow as to, well, the different teams will be working away in their environments, and then this shows how we then share information around the team at different stages for different things to happen, right? And so you can see here that we're primarily based around an Autodesk suite of tools. And so you can see here that it shows that, architectural, structural, and building services teams would all be working in Revit software. You may have civil teams or supplier teams that are working in some other system, but we can also integrate those into our federated models. And you can see there at the top there at BIM 360 Docs, right? That's the aggregator of a lot of our information, and so that's what we'd call our CDE, right? Our Common Data Environment. From there, we then, depending on what you're doing, we can push that into a number of different tools, right? Depending on what you want to do. So an example of that would be, right, you want to do a VR walkthrough, right? Because you've got a stakeholder that wants to understand their space. And so what happens here, you see on the workflow, is you push it from BIM 360 Docs into Navisworks. It can go directly into VR Collab, actually. And then you have some sort of VR review. When you're done with that, you can actually loop back around and push that back into the BIM 360 Docs, or you can push it into a CSV format and share it around as some sort of dashboard, right? And you can see that ends up leading to informing the project team on what's happened. It could be the design leads, the project managers, or the quantity surveyors, and at the end case ends up going to a client. Another example of using that design authoring information, and it's a key one which I'll touch on later, it talks about is clash detection, and that can be done either in software such as Autodesk Navisworks or something like Revisto, and then you can use those again to inform dashboards, create issues dashboards, and make sure that you're closing out those issues. Now, this obviously all loops back, and so there's a feedback cycle of, well, even though the team that's authoring the design, right, the designers and modelers, they are ones producing the information. It then those inputs get passed through to the project team, and then you get information back from, right, you get decisions, right? And so then it loops all the way back around in a circle back to that start, back to those base teams, and then you just loop through that cycle again, right? So this is something that you might want to think about, right, for your competition, as in when you're setting up that workflow of, or how we're going to transfer information around and do different tasks. It would be good to start with a blank piece of paper and a pen and think about, well, okay, how are we going to work, right? What softwares do we want to use? Because what's not shown here, right, is there's a whole other realm, like I had on the previous slide, a realm of connects into this in terms of design design analysis softwares, which can link into all these things. So if we move on, this is just again a screenshot example of that Revisto is what I mentioned before. Again, this is a way of keeping track of all those issues. So it's a similar function to actually what BIM 360 Docs can do, but some may find it's more user-friendly in a or otherwise. That just depends what they're used to, right? But you can see there that there's issues, and then they're tagged to specific users, and then you can have a chat on the side of saying, some sort of backwards and forwards with your colleagues, which is quite appropriate at this sort of time, right, where we're all isolated, we can't gather together. You can keep informed of what's going on, and you can stay up to date, and you can chat around an evolving design. Something that's more geared towards MEP, right, and it's actually part of your brief, I believe, in the as part of the scoring criteria, right? It's around this idea of collaboration and conflict resolution. And the information and how far you resolve things is only as good as what you set up your criteria to be in the first place, right? And the reason why I say that is If you said, all right, my project is clash free, I ran a clash report and it's clash free, and then I would say, well, okay, what did you clash against each other, right? And what were your tolerances, and how did you define the parameters and all that sort of thing, right? So there's again, here's a guide as to this is actually what we do in the real world. Is we have a matrix like this, right? And it lists down, these are majority MEP items, but then you also see ARCHI and structural items. And if you can read into some of those, it says things like, well, we're going to run a clash report and compare, MEP equipment against electrical equipment and see what's the result of that. And we're also going to compare hydraulics major drainage pipe work against fire major pipe work. And so you end up, with hundreds of different types of clash tests which you run against each other, and you get results. And so depending on the size of your project, you can start with generating, upwards of 100,000 clashes, which you have to prioritize. And the table there on the right-hand side is an example of how we like to categorize our clashes, being blocker, critical, major, minor, and trivial. And you start reporting those at different stages of a project. And the example would be, right, a blocker clash, which is the priority 1. Actually, maybe that's not a good example to use because I don't think there's any on this particular table. But let's say a critical clashes, right? There's some in here, for example, drainage pipe work, major drainage pipe work clashing with electrical equipment, right? Because that's a fundamental thing that you don't want to have happen. You can't mix the water with the electricity. So if you've identified any of those types of clashes, then those are called critical clashes, which need to be resolved, quite soon. Whereas there's trivial clashes, which we would categorize as something which, it's down to a level of detail that is that can only be resolved on site, because the tolerances at play are very specific based on the specific brands and manufacturers that are used, and the final tolerances that are of slabs and walls and things like that. So this is the basis of how we would set up to successfully collaborate and resolve any of these conflicts on a project. And again, the tool on the previous slide was more about issues, and that's more around design issues. How you would then report on the clashes from this is you might want to create a dashboard, right? And the way that, again, we've done it successfully, and perhaps you want to think about how you would integrate into your workflows, is something similar, right? So how to report on these clashes. And so this is one of our example dashboards. It says, well, look, this was when we exported all this information, and this shows how we've resolved clashes over time. And it also says, what's open, and you can choose search by discipline and things like that. So you can see that over time that, at the beginning there was a lot more open clashes, and over time it was, that closed, the grey line was getting higher and higher, because it meant we were closing more and more clashes, right? And so this information is pulled from either the BIM 360 clash from their CDE, or is from Revisto, and then this is actually pulled into a Power BI dashboard though. So, and then it can be made accessible, hosted and made accessible to the whole design team to report on the clashes. Now, so that's really, from in a very short time, is some of the ideas you might want to take into account for what you want to set up on your project to successfully do that sort of collaboration and conflict resolution. The last one I just wanted to have the last couple of points I wanted to have a discussion on was a little bit about design automation. So you may or may not have seen, quite a lot of visual scripting and that sort of thing going on from an architectural and structural perspective. it does get more challenging, I mean, in my opinion, from MEP to come up with some of these scripts for MEP systems, just because the level of parameters that you have at play when you're comparing how many different systems you need to coordinate. So things that we end up creating for design automation is more around designing automation of calculations which confirm what we've modeled is going to perform how we think it's going to perform, right? So the one on screen here is an example of, we had drawn a ventilation system, and then what we had done is extracted out all the dimensional information and system information and tabulated what the system pressure drop was going to be. And then that meant we could size our fan correctly, and say, yep, the flow and pressure requirements of that fan, and we could then successfully go and schedule that fan, right? Other ideas which you might want to think about for design automation from an MEP perspective is things around which are driven based on code requirements. And so even though this is quite broad in terms of what the criteria are for the actual design, you might want to take leverage from, use some of the specific Singapore examples for code requirements and create scripts that automatically generate the placement of, it could be emergency lighting or sprinkler heads and things like that, right? So so you can get into that sort of level of detail when it says, well, you only need to place these, 1 every 12 square meters. Therefore, you can generate something that generate a script that will then, look at the boundaries of a space, assess what the hazard occupancy is of the space, and therefore do the sprinkler head layout accordingly. So there's a few things like that. When it comes to successfully coordinating, 10 to 12 different disciplines, I've yet to find someone who's got a script that does that all in one go, but it doesn't mean to say that it's not possible. The other design automation, which is loosely linked to MEP, I wouldn't say in a major way, but it's more around some of the design tools around analysis of system efficiency performance, right? So there's a software that we use called IES, which can do energy modeling, right? So once you've designed a system, you can use the energy modeling software to then predict the performance of your building, right? And say, well, look, we can use daylight harvesting in certain situations, therefore we can turn off lights. We might have solar. You'd be able to assess how well your facade is performing by doing some sort of solar analysis. You'll be able to see shadows, that sort of thing. So those software like that, or a design tool like I think even Ladybug or Honeybee, I think is another one, that will have those sorts of packages linked in, so you can use them in a similar sense of visually scripting them by either Dynamo or Grasshopper alternatives. So then you can quickly run cycles on a proposed design architecturally to then see what the effect is on an MEP system. Otherwise, from there, the last part that I want to touch on was a more of a bit of a buzz about smart systems, and they're obviously increasingly popular at the moment. And so I've got a few ideas of what things you may want to consider integrating into your projects. And so this is just a quick list of all these types of things which are quite hot at the moment, right? So like IoT is a big one, and that can encompass a lot of different things. But sensor networks which are able to monitor a wide variety of conditions, right? So it could be things like temperature, it could be things like lux level, but again, increasingly, there's things that are even more popular, right, around well-being. It's particulate levels, right? It could be CO2 levels. It could be formaldehyde levels. Any of these other particulates in the air, which give measures to say how clean it is, right? So those are getting quite popular, and it also helps inform. It actually does help inform the MEP systems in terms of how well they're performing or how well they need to perform to make sure that the quality of the air in a certain spaces, is good, right? Or that the occupants feel comfortable, right? So you can think to propose, analytics systems which measure these types of variables and react to and change the MEP systems in time, basically in real time, reacting to the number of occupants, right? So if you've got a meeting space that's very large and you only see people on, and you've got a system that's measuring using infrared to measure people, and it sees that there are only 3 people in a space that's got 4 tables, what it can then do is tell the lighting system to, hey, dim down the lights in the other areas because no one's there, right? We're wasting power, and just keep the lights on in the area that where the people are, right? And it doesn't mean to say that you're going to turn them off, but it would mean to say that you'll dim them down, which is significantly reducing the energy of that system. So other things around like video-based parking guidance and parking guidance systems. Those ones, if you've got car parking systems, and if you're thinking of a mall development or something like that, right? When you go and park your car, and it's 2 things: either to alert you where empty spots are, or once you've parked your car, how to find it again, right? And so you can use those types of systems to check those sorts of things, right? And then lastly would be things around facility staff dispatch, right? And that idea is, if you've got usage of a system, or it could be, say, for example, a public toilets, and you want to have a schedule to say how often they should be cleaned, right? And rather than just saying to someone, well, go every day or twice a day and check it, how about doing it based on a more predictive manner, and using it based on people, right? The number of people that run through that those toilets would then give an indication as to how frequently they may need to be cleaned. And so you can think of other examples. Again, it could be trash cans or other facilities that can be monitored in a similar manner. So these are a whole array of smart solutions which you can think to implement as part of perhaps your developments or your competition developments that you're going to come up with. So that really brings me to the end of just a quick overview of digitalization in terms of MEP. There is plenty more which could be discussed, but I think that strikes a balance of give you some ideas. So if there is any questions, I think if we're taking questions now, I'll leave that to anyone on the call.
Yeah, please feel free to ask questions to Darren. I think we're more than happy to answer your queries as well. It's an interesting sharing, Darren. I think something to think about. The IoT one is actually quite an interesting bit.
Yeah, there's an example of that actually is one of the universities here, their wet science building. They implemented that, right? They put IoT sensors through all of their laboratories and things like that, which were then they were able to track usage of all of their spaces. And so the benefit of that, what came out of it was they'd done that, and then they were able to show that, hey, we actually need to build a new building because all of our labs are always booked all of the time, right? or that sort of thing. So those are real life examples of how you can utilize those types of systems and retrofit them later without needing to have a fixed infrastructure.
Yeah, it's good.
So, hi Darren. I have a question. It's really a interesting presentation. So I'm looking at the workflow diagram that you presented in the first few slides. I'm just really curious, like, who maintains that? So is Becca doing that, or and how do you get everyone on board of this? That's something that I'm really interested.
Yeah, so that's a great question actually, because I didn't touch on it. So most of the time what ends up happening is on projects here, right, you need to have someone who's acting as the project, they call it project BIM manager, I suppose, right? So you can see there that in the top left-hand corner of most of the bubbles or boxes, they have a, that's who's responsible for some of these steps. Now, so they're responsible for, you would say, facilitating and making sure that the platform is working as expected. So that, in terms of the BIM 360 Docs environment, they'd be setting it up, making sure it's the folder structures there and things like that. But it does rely on all of those participants, architecture, structure, and building services, whoever else is in the project, to regularly upload their information, right? But then from there, that's when that person as the BIM manager for the project would be the one then pushing through into those other activities, right? Pushing it from, okay, we've got the inputs. All right, now I'm going to generate clash reports. Now I'm going to set up VR reviews and things like that and invite any of those stakeholders or architects and whoever. And so it really is, we believe it's really it can be one of those leads, right? It can be, ends up being the architect, right, as the lead consultant, might be the one who is also got the hat of BIM manager, or depending on the type of project, if it's a more industrially focused project, right, and it's driven by a process or like an MEP system, then it may be the MEP consultant who's the one that's driving all of this. But more and more, what I would comment is more and more it seems to be happening is it's basically starting to be a business as usual type of activity, and so it's becoming integrated in as to, look, you can't just be the M&E consultant anymore. You've got to be working with all of these tools, right, and know how to use them. So that's what we're seeing more and more. So at the moment, it is the specific role of this person, and I think in the future we're going to see that it's just integrated across all of the design team, and so it may be the client's platform in the end, and then the architect, structure, and M&E are just utilizing that and then running all these activities from there.
Yeah, because looking at this, so this is a standard like a kind of like the template that Becca uses for running their project, because it looks like there's a lot of connection, and then that means there's a lot of maintenance, right? So when, let's say, Revit update itself and so on, that means you have to update the links and make sure that they connect well and stuff. So like so this yeah, that's what I'm wondering. So like, because then this becomes a work by itself, and then is there like a kind of standard template that Becca uses whenever they engage in a project?
Yeah, so this is, and the good thing about most of these tools is actually you can automate a lot of parts of this process, right? So you can automatically schedule to push things from your design environment or your authoring your own hub into this shared hub, you could say, right? And then at the same time, you can automatically set things up to run weekly clash detections and issue reports and things like that. So it does. I always look at this document and see it as, like, to someone seeing this for the first time. Sorry, there's some background noise. To someone seeing this for the first time can be a bit overwhelmed, but it is actually about as simple as it gets in terms of a process. It's just there's a lot of things happening at the same time.
But so I'm wondering, so this is a very Autodesk based workflow. So what if some of the team, like architectural or structural team, do not use the Autodesk product, but is it extendable to other software products?
Yeah, so that's where actually you might want to substitute what your CD is. So yes, historically and even now, right, they don't talk well with each other if you're switching between your main authoring platforms. So that's where you may, instead of using, the BIM 360 Docs as the environment for hosting things, you might want to consider something like BIM Collab or BIM Track or one of those other alternatives. That's more convenient to using different authoring softwares. I mean, it ends up being that IFC becomes the aggregator, that common platform as it's supposed to. So I think, to be honest, I can't quite remember how well BIM 360 Docs deals with IFC files. It's not something that we often come across. It's in my career, to be honest, there's only been 3 architects that have worked with a design software that isn't Revit. So it's not that prevalent, and every time that it happens, it doesn't end up as being something that's that collaborative, right? So there's still a lot to work on I think from the industry's point of view. It's getting better, but I think there are tools out there, like I was mentioning, that if you are thinking about using those different authoring softwares, that you can still have a workflow like this.
Okay, thank you. It's a really interesting whole connection of softwares and so on for me.
Yeah.
Anything else from anyone?
Yeah. Anybody? Any more questions for Darren? If they do have any questions for you, how can they contact you, Darren? Any emails or anything?
Yeah, actually, I didn't put it on. I'm not sure if they're going to share the slides. I didn't put it on my title slide, but I can always just drop it into the.
Yeah, you can put it in the meeting chat. You just your contact point. Then we can post that in the part of the YouTube link as well.
Yep. Yeah. Please do.
Okay. Sure. Okay. So thank you, Darren, for the sharing.